Welcome to Deep Dives with ISPU, a podcast by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We're discussing the latest one-of-a-kind research and data about topics affecting American Muslim communities today, with scholars and industry leaders from across the nation. You can subscribe to Deep Dives with ISPU wherever podcasts are found. Thanks for tuning in. Biannually, ISPU and a panel of our scholars sits down to decide the next batch of Young Scholar Awards winners. This is a competition that we hold to highlight and uplift the work of young scholars whose research focuses on topics related to Muslims in the United States. This year, after months of discussion, we named our first, second, and third place winners for 2021. Today, you'll hear a conversation between Petra Alsoofy, ISPU's Outreach and Partnerships Manager, and our 2021 Young Scholar Awards second place winner, Masooma Haider. Masooma's topic was titled The New Muslim Representatives, Analyzing the Unprecedented Rise in Muslim American Civic Participation After 2016. I hope you enjoy this conversation between Petra Alsoofy and Masooma Haider on Deep Dives with ISPU.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I am Petra Alsoofy, the Outreach and Partnerships Manager at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And I am joined today by Masooma Haider, who's one of our Young Scholar Award winners for 2021. Masooma have an MA in International Relations at University of Chicago. I just wanted to thank you for joining us today to have this conversation. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on, Petra. So I am a recent graduate of the International Relations program at UChicago. A lot of what my research looked at there was the recent rise in civic engagement in the United States of Muslim Americans and other minority groups. And I'm currently at the law school at Harvard Law School. I'm a first-year law student.
Congratulations for surviving the first year of law school. So your research is very, very timely in an area that ISPU and myself are very interested in. And as you mentioned, it looks at the rise of American Muslim civic participation, specifically American Muslims running for office. So your award-winning research project, The New Muslim Representative, and now analyzing the unprecedented rise in Muslim American civic participation after 2016, looks at the unprecedented increase in Muslim American political candidacies. Can you tell us a little bit, how did this award-winning research project develop? Why this topic and why now?
Yes, absolutely. So for a little bit of background, I graduated high school just as President Donald Trump had first been elected. So this has been something on my mind for quite some time. And I witnessed right after high school, in those years where I was in college, a huge increase in Muslim American civic engagement, both around myself in Chicago and also just in the mainstream. I mean, I had never turned on the TV and seen Muslims speaking on TV, but this was around the time that we first got Representative Ilhan Omar, we got Representative Rashida Tlaib, and that was something that I, just in a personal level, felt very impacted by. So when it came time to picking a research project when I was doing my graduate studies, there was a theoretical puzzle, I think, that had continuously kind of popped up in my research, which was this incredible rise that we were seeing within Muslim Americans. And a lot of the research at the time and academics were attributing it to sort of a reaction to perhaps stigmatization that had taken place, during the presidential campaign of Donald Trump, where we saw a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric used, right? We heard things like, banning Muslims from the United States. We actually saw that ban go into place, and just, so many more policies of Islamophobia. And so a lot of, researchers at the time were saying that this is most likely a reactionary measure. And in turn, we're seeing a lot of civic engagement just as a reaction to that. And something about that didn't sit right with me from, I think, a personal level as well. I know that Muslim Americans are people who have an incredible drive within ourselves and are, inherently very involved in our communities. We care about the politics of our local communities and abroad, and just didn't seem quite to encapsulate what was going on just from talking to people. The other issue with that was if it were truly to be a reaction to stigmatization, Muslim Americans as a demographic have seen stigmatization in another period as well. We saw a huge increase after 9/11 in terms of just like a spike in concentrated Islamophobic rhetoric, as well as, perceiving Islamophobia from maybe the general public, or just feeling perhaps stigmatized in certain ways, having a Muslim identity within the US at that time. It kind of begs the question as a researcher, why didn't we see quite the same level of civic engagement through the formal political infrastructure at that time? So that was sort of the key puzzle. I brought it up to my faculty advisors at the time, and they said that looks like it hasn't even been researched. And I was actually shocked to see that, no one was really uncovering that. So I just tried to intervene, step in, and see if I could kind of expand on what was going on there, shed some light on what was really happening in the Muslim American community.
That's very interesting to see that your personal reaction to it really pushed you to study it further, and the fact that it didn't sit well with you. So when you got started on this project, what did you expect to see? What did you expect to discover as part of this project? And were you surprised by what your research actually discovered?
So I looked first to try to understand what change had taken place, right, within the last 2 decades, specifically within Muslim Americans and in the structures that we have. Of course, immigration has been going on for Muslim Americans for quite some time. I mean, many Muslim Americans did not immigrate; they have been here for a very, very long time. But we know that there's been a huge influx since the 1960s, since the changing of the Civil Rights Act. And so I think that one of the things I expected when I was looking at the differences between the 9/11 era and then now the 2015, at the time, 2015, 2016, one of the things that I saw was just Muslim American institutions that had sprung up, right? I mean, we've had some incredible institutions either spring up during that time or strengthened during that time. So we saw a lot of involvement after 9/11 of organizations like CARE as spokespeople for the Muslim American demographic, or we had the ISPU, we had other more politically oriented organizations, in particular like Jetpack, Empower Change, Engage, all Muslim American institutions and organizations that are geared towards, bringing Muslim Americans publicly into the political structure and giving them sort of a voice and giving them the tools they need to be more politically involved and also just more civically engaged as Americans. That was one of the things that I truly expected to be sort of the critical causal factor in this change that we had witnessed. I was actually quite surprised to see that wasn't, it didn't play as active a role as I had expected. So initially, I really expected to see a lot of the interviews that I selected in my research to mention, organizations like Jetpack or Empower Change as being, influential in them being able to come forward. And make no mistake, they were very influential in simply the support that they provided. In fact, I think it's very important that we now as Muslim Americans have institutions that are, formally grounded and able to provide that support. But what was interesting was it seemed like there was on a more demographic level, there was a critical change taking place amongst Muslim Americans. That was the real factor behind this. And that finding was quite surprising.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that demographic change that you mentioned?
As a result of the research, after going through an interviewed, I think 20 to 30 candidates across the U.S., Muslim American candidates who had run for election, either during the 2015 period or after the 2015 period. And after I'd interviewed all these incredibly, amazing individuals from across the U.S., one of the themes that started to come out very consistently when I categorized the data was, one was the divide between candidates who were first-generation immigrants versus second or beyond. So a lot of Muslim Americans right now are going sort of the shifting phase in the immigration history of the United States for Muslim Americans in particular, where we're shifting towards more Muslim Americans who are now second generation. In other words, Muslim Americans who either were born here or came here at a very, very young age. So in other words, people who had their formative years within the United States, I would categorize those under second generation. Versus first-generation immigrants like my parents who immigrated during the 80s, during the 90s, along those lines. So a lot of the politicians, the candidates for office or the current politicians or past that I talked to actually fell very evenly between that divide, between first and second generation. So there were some immigrants and there were some, like myself, who were born here, raised here. The other divide that I saw come up, which was great for my research, evenly in the participants, was pre and post 9/11 generation, which I as a research category is, I think, a little bit of an innovation. There have been some incredible researchers recently, Muslim American academics, who have been sort of using this divide, and I used it in my research as well, which sort of looks at individuals who had their formative years, even if they were within the US, but before 9/11. So people who had sort of come of age, were adults, could understand what was going on, had maybe experienced the pre-9/11 era. And individuals who were from the post 9/11 generation, who, like myself, grew up sort of in the aftermath of 9/11, who didn't understand maybe what was going on at the time, and only, grew up in whatever came afterwards, after that. When looking at these two different groups and dividing their responses for each, an interesting, I would say, discovery that came out of this research, and completely unexpected, something I wasn't really looking for and sort of just stumbled upon, was this change in attitude. A very, very, very significant, almost unanimously different attitude between these two groupings, particularly between pre-9/11 and post-9/11 Muslims, but with a lot of overlap with post-9/11 and second-generation Muslims, where they sort of presented what I ended up calling a reformist attitude versus the previous group, the first generation, often pre-9/11 group, which presented more of a assimilationist and more of a what I call the changing of the guards attitude, pioneering attitude. The first group came along and essentially pioneered the path. They were the trailblazers. They mirroring a lot of what other minority groups in the U.S. have done, practiced a lot of head-down politics, and entered the system and paved that path. The second group, especially those that are running an election these days, a lot of people I talk to, some people who even ran for my high school as Muslim Americans for office, presented a very reformist attitude towards the political system. They viewed problems within the system not as something to simply act upon, but a system itself to actively change. So they came in as politicians, as candidates who believe that they're representing their communities, whether Muslim or not, just the local community that they live in or the state that they're running to represent, as having very crucial problems, right, in a systemic nature. And that they are facing, and believing that they're entering the system to change the system in a way that serves better the people that they are representing, both themselves, their community members, and the like. So I would say that was the key divide. The pioneer group actually focused more on what it meant to be American, asserting their American identity, and in engaging with the system in a way that politicians have been doing for many decades. Now, whether or not this mirrors sort of an overall more pervasive shift throughout just the American demographic is something that definitely serves to be studied further. But I think, at least within the Muslim American community, this appears unprecedented in terms of just the shift in engagement with the system from a more assimilationist standpoint to a more, reformist standpoint, where they seek to change the inequities that they perceive are there.
That's extremely fascinating. Again, just as researchers, but also on a personal level, as also a daughter of an immigrant and someone who came here as a young age, and just seeing how my attitudes toward a lot of things versus my parents' attitude. So I, could relate to that a lot. I think what would be really interesting is just to see how that racial and ethnic categories play into this conversation, especially the fact that we have a third of the American Muslim community is African American and Black, so not an immigrant community. So how that, if there's any overlap or differences. And ISP in the conversation you or what you just presented here mirrors what a lot of things that we found through ISPU's research, which we look at civic engagement very, very closely, and we've seen an increase in civic engagement over the years. You mentioned a lot of the organizations that have, either used our data or have worked on increasing American Muslim civic engagement and civic participation. And I think where they have succeeded is in increasing voter registration and voter participation, because we've been studying that for a few years, and we've seen a tremendous increase in reduction of those who were not registered, who were eligible to vote but were not registered to vote. So we've seen that success over the last few years. Even though American Muslims still lag behind other faith communities, there have been a very successful shift in increasing American Muslim civic engagement participation. But one other thing that's really interesting that our research is finding is it goes beyond just voter registration and voting. It goes into American Muslims are more likely to participate in town hall meetings, than other faith communities. They're also more likely to volunteer and donate to political campaigns. So there is a wider understanding of civic engagement and civic participation among American Muslims. And specifically to your research, we here in Michigan just had an election where recently 3 cities actually elected for the first time ever 3 Muslim American mayors, Dearborn, Hamtramck, and Dearborn Heights. And actually Hamtramck, the city of Hamtramck, which is a very diverse, ethnically and religiously very diverse city, have an all Muslim city council, the first in the nation, and a Muslim mayor. Are we seeing, is this increase or this rise in American Muslim political participation in terms of running for office or seeking appointments, is that the trend that we will continue to see?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, that is incredible. And I'm just so proud of the Muslim American community and the incredible wins that we've had recently. In terms of what's happening here, it fits perfectly with the research. I actually, when I was a grad student, utilized ISPU research data that you guys had. Very helpful, thank you. And tracked out the current trend, sort of after graphing, all the Muslim American candidates that we have on record to date in every state in the United States to see what this trend was. And if this was a visual presentation, I would love to show this graph. I'm very proud of it. that reflects this peak that we have beginning in 2015. And it's just an enormous upshoot where we start to see this incredible increase in Muslim American civic engagement. And yeah, I believe that it's continuing. It hasn't stagnated in any way. And I think it's going to continue. We're going to continue to see that. And hopefully Muslim Americans as a demographic can catch up and maybe even go beyond, because in the past, it's true, we've lagged behind in terms of engagement, especially compared to other faith groups. So I think that would be something really fascinating to see. And what we're seeing now is reflective of that. I think one of the things that is important to note is a lot of what's going on also reflects the population itself, right? Because Muslim Americans as a demographic are a very, very small percentage of the United States population. And for, this incredible, these incredible elections to take place, a lot of it is also just the image that these Muslim Americans have within their communities in Michigan and in other places in the United States, where we have communities of people who, of course, are not probably majority Muslim, but still seeking a Muslim American as their representative. It's a lot of people who are coming together and believing in, the campaigns of these Muslim Americans and being, accepting of a Muslim as their representative, right? To choose someone as their representative politically is to say that this is someone who can speak for me and who represents who I am. And the fact that they're, succeeding in these campaigns means that, they're doing incredible work. They're working with communities who believe in them and believe that they can represent them as Americans.
How can other researchers and those who are interested in American Muslim civic engagement, especially political participation, how can they use this research? I know there's a lot more questions that we're still as organizations and as a researchers still trying to figure out. But for now, how can we use this research?
I would love to see, for example, more, as you had mentioned, analysis of different ethnic groups, different racial groups within the Muslim American demographic, because my research, unfortunately, only was able to focus mainly on immigrant Muslims, but that is, just a small slice of the pie. So I think future research should definitely build on understanding what are these changes that are taking place, just taking into account, the many different trajectories that might be taking place within different ethnic or racial groups within Muslim Americans. Also, I think just studying this change in this generational divergence that's taking place, I think that is something that is really, really crucial right now to understand what it is that's going on within our demographic. A lot of our studying this change on, is Islam and civic engagement incompatible? Does Islam support or, repress civic engagement as an American? Or, does Islam prevent integration? So even when I was doing my research, got bogged down a lot in looking at that literature before I could actually move on and realize that maybe there's something more going on here. So I think it's really important for academics and Muslim American researchers to move beyond that. We've done we've established, that that's not the case, and to move on and actually look at what's going on in a deeper personal level in terms of shifts in political identity the ways that, the current climate has been affecting Muslims and the way that Muslims have been affecting that climate, the way they've been engaging and willing to challenge stereotypes and willing to challenge the trends, willing to go against, this idea that Muslim Americans don't engage in the political system. And look at us, we're doing it. We're doing it in amazing numbers. So one other thing I will say is, I think as an academic community, we should definitely begin to move away from this reactionary idea. I think that was, besides the generational divergence, one of the biggest findings of the study, I think that I would add is that it's a challenge to the reaction to Trump theory, where what we're seeing here is that it's not necessarily reactionary behavior to Trump, right? When we frame it like that, we give too much credit to Trump. I'm not a big fan of giving credit to Trump. What's happening here is actually coming from Muslim Americans themselves. Arguably, because this is something that's a generational divergence, whether or not we had President Trump, we could perhaps argue, and of course, I don't want to go into the hypothetical worlds, but we could perhaps argue that this would have happened either way, because what's the core of this change, the civic engagement that's taking place is coming from these Muslim Americans themselves, individuals who have grown up in the post 9/11 era or who are second generation Muslims and who, within themselves since childhood have cultivated this strong sense of civic engagement, this sense of belonging, this sense that not only are they hear, but they want to make this a better place to live for themselves, for their neighbors, for their families, regardless of whether Trump had come along. So I think that's a key finding of the study and something that I'd like to highlight that, it really helps to reframe and to understand that Muslims deserve credit for the change that has taken place.
That's a really important point. And I think it also just pointing this as a reaction, not only undermine what American Muslims want to do for themselves and for their communities, but also just underestimate how long it actually take for the political process to work. In a recent interview with the newly elected mayor of New York City, I think he was asked, when did you decide that you were going to run? And he said, I talked to, I forget the name, but I talked to someone, I asked someone 20 years ago, I asked him, what do I need to do to become the mayor, or I need to become the next mayor of New York City? And he said, here's what you need to do. 20 years later, here I am. So the political process, yes, it worked, in a short period for some, but for most people, it is a process that is lengthening, and there's a lot of training and preparation and just a lot of things that go into it. It's not, you just don't wake up and say, I'm going to be in office today. That's just not how it works. Where can we find you now? Where is this research taking you? What's next?
A lot of what I'm looking at now is more at the way that these systems, I guess I'm looking at the flip side of what I was studying in the past, which now I'm looking at the way that the system treats Muslim Americans. So if Muslim Americans are trying to change the system, why? What is the system doing? And so what I'm currently focusing on, and I hope to build upon in the coming years, is understanding in more detail, what are these policies of stigmatization? Why have they been legalized? Why is a lot of our system, our political system, and also just our governmental system structured in a way that it continues white supremacy, or it continues a lot of policies of securitization against different minority groups, and oftentimes harms Muslim Americans disproportionately, and studying that and seeing where that takes me.
This is all things that I'm really, really personally interested in. So I will look forward to continue to follow your work and read more of it. And I hope, to see more of it shared with the public. So thank you so much for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Petra. Really appreciate it.
Fascinating conversation.
Petra, really appreciate it. Petra.
Thank you to Petra and Masooma for this dive into American Muslim civic participation. Masooma is currently a first-year law student at Harvard Law School, and you can revisit and share the specifics of her research at ispu.org/young-scholar-award. If you enjoyed this episode of Deep Dives with ISPU, subscribe today, and if so inclined, even leave us a review. You can learn more about the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding's research at ispu.org. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the ISPU, and on Instagram at the _ISPU. Thanks for tuning in.